Hello, everyone. My name is Dennis Kim, Concertmaster of your Pacific Symphony. I'm not actually at home today, but I have the great honor and privilege to be here with a good friend of mine, Joe Bein. I guess there's many things that he is, but the way we met is very important because it was when I was living in Hong Kong, and we needed a new person for our fantasy baseball league, and Joe happily volunteered to take all our money. So that's where I first met Joe, and I've been friends with Joe for a long time. And please help me welcome Joe Bein.
Excellent. Thank you, Dennis. That's good to see you. As you know, I'm a big fan of the Pacific Symphony, and so it's just nice to see your face, and it's just nice to be involved and talking to people who want to talk about classical music and violins again.
Yeah, I mean, Joe not only has come seen the Pacific Symphony in live concerts, he also did a little presentation for some of our board members at the Podlick's house, where he brought incredible instruments. It was amazing. That I don't know how many Strads there are in the world right now, but I think he had 6 Strads in this house in California, and it was a real pleasure to play them and to have the board members discuss and see them in person. So it was fantastic. And yeah, can you just, I don't know if you remember, but do you remember the instruments that you brought to California at that time?
So we were fortunate to have 6 Stradivari or 6 instruments like that. It was your Stradivari. I believe we had the 1692 Falmouth, which was a Cavacos fiddle. There was a 1728 Stradivari violin. And then I think we could have had 2 Deljesus as well. And then maybe, something else. But I mean, that's the thing that's so nice, is when you can just kind of like, break down that wall, because I feel like it seems so inaccessible to so many people. And, it's like if in my office and people walk by, and they have the same look that I have when I walk by a Ferrari dealer, where I just kind of look in the window and I know I'm not supposed to go in there. And people have that about some of these old violins, particularly Stradivarius and Neri and things like that. And so anytime there's an opportunity to kind of like make it more accessible, break it down, those are the things that are most fun to me.
As many of you in the Pacific family know, I have the pleasure and honor to play the 1701 Dushkin Stradivarius that a close friend of mine, has let me use. And I mean, of course, playing this instrument is amazing and life-changing. But when I was looking for this instrument, to be honest, that was incredible. To have people like Joe come to Korea, to Hong Kong with these incredibly valuable instruments, and for me to just try them for 2-3 days, and really it was incredible to be able to touch these pieces of arts, and now I've had my violin for the last 13 years, and it's really part of me. I mean, I always joke with my sponsor, if he takes the violin back, that I'll quit violin. But it's an incredible process, and Joe and people like Joe are a big part of it, because I mean, if you're looking for a Strad, I mean, who do you call? And you call Joe.
Thanks. Well, I mean, it's nice. The whole, I mean, it makes sense, and sometimes the simplest answer is the best. But when you think about what were the sounds that these composers were thinking of? What was Brahms thinking of when he wrote his concerto? Well, he was working with his friend Joachim, who owned several Stradivari violins. And what was Tchaikovsky thinking when he wrote his famous violin concerto and then showed it to his teacher Leopold Auer, who had a Stradivari violin? These are the instruments that the music we love the most is meant to be played on. These are the instruments that the composers themselves heard, and sometimes the very instruments. And so it's not, it makes sense that when we have the opportunity to hear the best music and the best Mozart and the best Bach and the best Brahms and things like that, it almost always sounds better on these types of instruments that are of the period and are what the composers intended us to hear them on.
I'm going to ask a lot of questions today that I know the answers to, but I know that our audience has these questions, and I get asked these questions all the time. But I'm going to ask you these tough questions. And please, anyone who's out there watching, please send in your questions through the chat. This is a chance to ask questions that really, I mean, this is an expert that you wouldn't be able to meet on the street.
Yeah,
so
and this is a lecture. Let's have this. This would be good to be a conversation.
Exactly. So the first question is, why is Strad so valuable, and is Strad better than other makers?
So one of the reasons they're so valuable is that, so the reason we're here, the reason that, you know, you and I know one another, the reason that we have had an opportunity to travel, you know, you've done it independent of, we've each done it by ourselves and also together, to be in these incredible places like the Public Home and others, is really, it's really because of one name, and it's Stradivarius and Stradivari. So we have one picture of a trip that we happened to be in Hong Kong together. And so Alexi, he has this picture of a room that we happen to be in. This is a room unlike, I mean, it's unlike almost anything I've ever been in. And so Dennis and I are in the room, and you can see this is a room that is literally covered in Picassos and Warhols and Rembrandts and some of the most beautiful art that I've ever seen. And there's a collection of the really, really successful and important, sort of like almost like the aristocracy of Hong Kong is all in this room. These people, they have companies, they have Picassos, they have Mercedeses, they have boats, and they have everything that you could want. And yet one of our mutual friends, Dennis's sponsor, he gets together with this group of friends and they drink wine together and things like that. But he has the one thing that they don't, and the one thing that brings everybody together, and he has a Stradivari violin. And that's what all these people want to know about, which I think is just a testament to the incredible, not only the brand name, but also just the incredible nature and the allure and just how special these instruments really are. And so I've already done it several times, sort of switched between Stradivari and Stradivarius. And one of the reasons that you'll hear both is that they are the same. And so now we are here because of a person named Antonio Stradivari. And he was born in Italy. We actually don't know when he was born, but he was born in either 1648 or 1649. And he died in 1737. And he built these beautiful instruments starting in 1666. And so we think that in his lifetime, he lived to be 92, which we should all be so fortunate to live to that age. And he probably built over 1,000 instruments by most estimates. And currently there are about 550 violins left in the world. There are about 50 cellos. There are only 11 violas. And then it goes to say he was a woodworker. So there's a harp. There are several guitars. There are a couple little mandolinos that are gorgeous. There are even children's instruments, which I've been fortunate enough to hold in my life. And so one of the reasons we go back and forth between these names are the labels that are inside these violins. So if you ever are around Dennis, and he has a label on the inside of his violin, and it's about the size of a fortune cookie wrapper. And so we have a picture of one of these labels. And what you'll see is that Italy back then, and like a small history lesson, is that Italy was a number of city-states back then. So it wasn't a unified country until much more recently. And so the Florentines and the Neapolitans and the Venetians, they all actually kind of had a different dialect. And I was always told growing up that it was the writings of Dante Alighieri, who was a Florentine. And it was his writings, because he was one of the first truly great, widely published authors, and that the Florentine Italian became the Italian we know today. But so there was one language that everybody spoke, not only all across Italy, but all across the world, and that was Latin, because you heard it in Mass every day. And so Catholic masses always used to be in Latin. And so what these makers did is they took their names and they Latinized them. So this is a genuine Stradivari label that's inside a violin. And you can see, so instead of Antonio Stradivari, it actually says Antonius Stradivarius, Cremonesius, which is the town he was in, Cremona, and then Facibat Anno is made in, year of, and then he would write in the date. And so again, trying to be economical, usually you would have a bunch of labels printed at once, and you'd have the first, date, the first number printed, and the rest. So that way you
like a check
labels every year. So Dennis's violin, for example, will have the 1 and the 7 printed, and then the O and the 1 will be in his handwriting. So this is where this name Stradivarius comes from. But Stradivarius and Stradivari are exactly the same person and the same thing. And the reason they are the most valuable is that there are so few of them. And they're spread all across the world. And each year, that supply decreases almost on a permanent basis. And thankfully, it's not because of damage or because of theft or anything like that. They actually, strangely, that very rarely, almost never happens. But it's because these violins become the property of institutions like the Smithsonian or like the Royal Academy or the Chicago Symphony or the Dallas Symphony, things like that. And so when these instruments go into these sort of quote unquote permanent collections, it's very unlikely that they'll ever be sold again. And so meanwhile, the demand for these continues to grow and the need for them continues to grow, and yet the supply diminishes. So that's why, we have the most basic economic principle of supply and demand, which kind of carries these things forward.
Right. Joe, you're gonna keep your questions shorter because there's so many questions. So you gotta try to stop talking so much. Gosh. There's a question someone asked, and they said, you said something before Stradivarius, and what was that? So I played the 1701 Dushkin Stradivarius, and my violin was owned by Samuel Dushkin, who was a friend of Stravinsky's. But Joe also said the Falmouth, and so what are these names attached to the Stradivarius?
Perfect. So names can come from usually famous historical owners. So for example, the Perlman, the Piatigorsky Stradivari cello, the Dushkin, and then the Joachim there, and then these instruments get names, and then sometimes they actually have names that are connected more to their aesthetics. So for example, Philippe Quint, who I think has probably played with you by now, he plays the Ruby Stradivari. And the ruby originally was Il Rubino, which is because of this like luscious red varnish that's covered all over it. So
Exactly. And some of these names change. I know when a new owner gets it, sometimes they even change. But Philip Quint has played with us. Anna Kiko Myers, who also owns an incredible Strad. And it's amazing whenever a soloist comes to the orchestra, a violin soloist. Usually it's a Strad or Deljesu, and it's amazing comparing instruments. And usually they want to see my instrument, and I want to see their instruments. Yeah. There's another name that you said in your talk. What is Neri Deljesu, and how does he compare, and what's better?
So Neri Deljesu is Stradivari's great rival and his great contemporary. And so they are literally 1A and 1B in the violin world. And you almost can, but he was never as rich and as powerful as Stradivari. He was almost sort of like the alternative. And his instruments are actually slightly more valuable than Stradivari's. And just for context's sake, the upper end of a Stradivari instrument now is over $20 million. And so, but his instruments, Neri Deljesu, are actually maybe even a little more valuable because there's only 141 of them. And they became famous with Niccolò Paganini. And Paganini played a Neri Deljesu. So did Jascha Heifetz. So did Pinchas Zuckerman. So did numerous other soloists, like exclusively played those. So most soloists, concertmasters, collectors, it's usually one or the other. And ideally, as Dennis and I have talked about, the goal is really to have both.
Exactly. I tell my sponsor all the time that every violinist who was worth anything had both the Strad and Deljesu. and I only have a Strad, so it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Um, it's, the Pacific Symphony is rare. That I think we're the only orchestra in the world where we have two Strads in the orchestra that are not owned by the orchestra. Both Rob Schmitzky and I have violins. Uh, both of us have Strads. He has a long pattern Strad, and I have the Dushkin. And yeah, we both have them independently of the orchestra. But I know orchestras like the New York Phil, the LA Phil, Berlin Phil, all have Strads.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, obviously it's a great investment, but also a huge thing for the orchestra to say that we know this is the LA Phil Strad or the New York Phil Strad. So,
you know, we have friends obviously like, and once you, I mean, I think the instruments that as orchestras own instruments, you know, here in Chicago, as Dennis, you know, we have two Stradivari violins and a Stradivari cello, you know, those become competitive advantages and
exactly.
retain talent too. So, you know, people know when they sit at the front of an orchestra and they have a Stradivari violin, they know if they want to leave and take another job, the violin doesn't go with them. And so, you know, people win jobs and they know, and the jobs that have instruments attached to them, you get better talent going to those because people want those types of instruments that otherwise they could never afford.
We have a question from somebody asking, they said, how does one become a violin dealer or expert?
So my path is the more traditional one, which is basically, you know, nepotism. And so I got it because my father was in the business, but I'm, you know, part of a multi-generational musical family. You know, my grandparents were music professors, and I have distant relatives even who were the founders of the Israeli Philharmonic, and so my whole family are, you know, are musicians and conductors and teachers and violinists and Suzuki professors and things like that. So, but the way to do it is actually you really have to be around these instruments. And it is it's something that you learn, but it's infinite basically. So you never know everything. It's not like learning a piece of music or learning the 50 capitals to the 50 states. It's something that is infinite, and it involves just like you know, there are attributes like having big hands that could help you be a better violinist. It helps to have a very good memory to study and appraise and identify violins. And it involves talking with colleagues, and it involves, you know, I look at violins like flashcards, quite honestly. And I spend time studying them and pick makers, you know, every day or every week or every month, and just kind of refresh my memory. And you continue to do that.
The reason I appreciate Joe, because I know a few Joes, obviously. There are different dealers throughout the world, but I truly believe that Joe loves the violin. He loves music. He came to a Pacific Symphony concert from Chicago to hear me play. I mean, this is not something that violin dealers do.
You know,
This is a gentleman who loves music, and then I mean the personal relationship is very important to him. And this is, I mean, to be honest, I haven't actually bought anything from Joe, but if I ever have enough money to buy something, I would buy something from Joe because not only is he an expert and does he have the contacts to get the right instruments, but he's someone that I like hanging out with. I know that he is someone who's genuine, and he really loves music and loves violins and loves violinists. So that's something special for me.
That's nice. I mean, I thank you, of course. And, you know, I'm like you, where I have an amazing wife who keeps me on the straight and narrow. You know, I follow orders very well, and except for the mustache, of course, which was my own.
Oh, gosh. We have so many questions, so I'm going to go to some questions. So the first question is, can you tell us the difference between the auction price, like an auction place like Teresio, and a regular price? I mean, what is the difference in, you know, because some people look at a Strad and they say, you know, you can get a Strad on auction for $1 million, but then you say it's $20 million. Why the big difference?
Yeah, you know, I think it can be kind of inconsistent, and I think it generally things sold by private firms, you know, such as mine, they tend to be higher than auction prices, but that's not always the case. There are certainly times where things sort of get, you know, escalated at an auction price, and I feel like my colleagues and I will look back and be like, I can't believe that sold for that. And generally, I mean, and I think it's important to recognize, like, Tarisio, they set the record for a sale price for a Stradivari violin when the Lady Blunt was sold. So it's not always cheaper. That was a legitimate world record and an amazing event that also had just that benefited the tsunami victims in Japan and also coincided with the most, not just a Strad, but maybe the most famous. And so, but I do think that I think the auction rooms it's a little bit unorthodox for a lot of people who want to buy violins unless you're a professional. And so they don't generally give you the opportunity to try it at home or show your teacher or play it over several weeks in concerts with your colleagues and see how it projects. So it's not for everybody. But certainly, like, if you know what you're doing, and I can buy things at auction, but not everybody wants to make up their mind in a room in a very short amount of time. And so I think the benefit to that, though, is you can get sometimes a better deal.
As a player, that's why auctions are more difficult, because we don't get a chance to play. I mean, when my donor bought the Strad, I had the Strad for at least a month.
Yeah.
And no auction house will let you play a violin for a month. I mean, they'll let you play for an hour maybe. And to make a decision on $1 million violin in an hour is obviously very difficult. So there's some questions I know the answers to, but I'm going to ask them because, of course, I mean, these are questions that people have.
That's great.
Do you handle less expensive string instruments, like 200,000, 50,000?
So I like to work with my friends, and my friends who are soloists, my friends who are, concertmasters, and my friends who are modern makers too. So I have really strong and wonderful relationships with makers, not just here in Chicago, but all over the country, that I love to get bows from them. I love to get instruments from them. And so I think that, for me personally, like, the modern makers I work with generally are about $20,000 and up, or around there. And then cellos can be a little bit more. But I mean, I love working with modern makers right now, just because I think modern making has never been better. And information sharing and technology has basically, it's brought the floor of making up in this country and others, like, way, way higher. And so you, as a violinist, or cellist, you have so many more options now than you did, say, 25 years ago. Like when you were in school, Dennis, there were very few modern makers that you could just have a career with. And now the choices are pretty abundant.
So this is a question that I'm always asked also, and there's so many YouTube videos about stuff like this, comparing a $5 million violin and a $5,000 violin. Why is there such a difference when, especially the Chinese, can copy an instrument to the exact same measurements, use the wood from the same period? What's the secret?
So we don't know the secret. It still is a secret. But I think the most obvious answer is that, Stradivari was a better craftsman than anybody else. And most modern makers will tell you that too. And if I haven't met too many people who have the hubris to think that they can build a better violin than Stradivari did. But so just from a skill standpoint, what Stradivari did still cannot be equaled. But I think what's interesting to me is that, like, these, the context in these settings, I think, is always worth noting, because, you'd be the person to ask about this, Dennis. It's like, how did you play your Stradivari violin the first day compared to how did you play it a month later to 10 years later to how you play it now? I don't think there's probably any question you sound better now than you did back then. And did you know how to approach a Strad right away? And did you know how to settle it? But what I like to point out is that, aside from, like, these one circumstances, I like to look at, okay, let's go all the way back. Let's go back to Viotti. Let's go to Paganini. Let's go to Vieuxtemps, Isai, Joachim, Milstein, Perlman, Huberman, Piatigorsky, Perlman, Ma, everybody you want to think, how is it possible that of all the violins in the world, all of these names, with very few exceptions, keep coming back to the same two makers? Right. And who knows more about the violin or the cello than they do? I don't. These are the best artists who've ever lived. And they can pick anything they want. And if they could pick something different, then they would. But these are the instruments that give them that, I imagine, because I don't speak for them, but these are the instruments that allow them to do the most, with their playing. It's like we almost have like a 300-year focus group, and we keep coming back to the same answer. So I feel like the proof is kind of in the pudding.
Yeah, I answer this question similarly. Anyone who does that test on YouTube, not one of them, even if it sounds better, not one of them would choose the $50,000 violin. They would all, if they had a choice, they would all choose the Strad, the Deljesu. And like you said, modern making is incredible now, and there are some very good makers that sound great. But for me, in a big hall, to be able to play Heldenleben or Scheherazade and play as softly as I want and still be able to cut through the orchestra and hit the back of the Sacred String Hall, that's why I feel lucky having the Strad. And and many times I feel without that kind of instrument, I couldn't do some of the things that I do. So so anyone who can, I think they would prefer the Strad over the $50,000 violin.
Yeah, I think.
Again, this is a question I know because I've done it with you, but how do you travel with some of these very expensive instruments?
So I travel with intimidating people like Dennis. Because Dennis has like 8 Louis Vuitton suitcases when he travels. Nobody's looking at me. He just, they see him and know that that's the person they want to go for. But, for me, it's, I keep my head down. I get on the plane early, and they go in the overhead above me. And if I have a cello, the cello gets a seat. I buy a seat for it. I don't get the miles, and it sits next to me. And so, cello Bein travels with me when need be. And then generally, and then when I land somewhere, I do think it's beneficial to let the violins or the cello, I think it's beneficial to let them settle for overnight. Just because of the shock of the altitude and the lack of the humidity, and then coming back down, I think they do benefit from just sort of like having a moment to decompress. And then I see people the next day generally.
Right. And there's times that we've traveled, not together, but we left at the same time, where he would give me 4 violins. And there are cases that hold 4 violins. There are, of course, a lot of cases that hold 2 violins, but there's cases that hold 4 violins. And sometimes when you're carrying, $30-40 million of instruments, that's scary. I have a story, but I'm sure you have many more. Any funny stories at immigration?
So my dad's late partner, Jeff Fushi, there was this wonderful story where there was an exhibit in Cremona for Stradivarius' 250th death, for the anniversary of it. So there was a huge Stradivari exhibit in Cremona in 1987, and we, our family was responsible for getting things there from the States and things like that. And so at one point, after the exhibit is over, Jeff has 2 4-way cases, and he has 8 Stradivari violins with him. You could travel with a lot more luggage back then. This is 1987. So he's going through Malpensa, at which point, the Milan airport, where the guys still in the Italian National Guard have the big assault rifles, and they're standing there, and it's very intimidating. And they look at this guy, and they see this big American, and he's got these big suitcases, and they're like, what's in the violin? What's in there? And he's like, violins. And he's like, what kind of violins? He's like, Stradivari. He said, well, how many? And he goes, all of them. Start laughing too, because that's ridiculous, because nobody ever that's fine, and they just wave him right through customs, even though he was holding 8 Strads. It was so that nobody could possibly do it, so
No, it's a similar story, but I was flying, especially when I lived in Europe. I flew a lot, and Finnish people are very educated, and they know about everything. And so I was going through the airport in Finland, and the guy at the border was a little bit rough with the fiddle. I said, please be careful. It's very valuable. This is, at that time, I just said, this is a $3 million violin. He's like, please don't exaggerate.
Yeah.
I'm a musician. I play the drums.
Yeah.
And I said, yes. If I was going to exaggerate, why would I say 3 million? I would have said this is $10,000. There's a lot of nightmarish stories you've heard on the internet where people insist that you check the violin. So there's a picture of Victoria Mulova, who has her violin in her boat in a plastic bag, and she's carrying it on board, and she had to ship the case. So there's a lot of horror stories, and a lot of damage, of course, done by airlines. But yeah, we could sit here and talk about those stories all day. I wish this Zoom was 10 hours, Joe. I mean, there's so many questions, the most questions we've ever had.
It would just be the two of us talking about the Raptors. So.
Yeah, we can talk about sports all day, which would be much more interesting, I would think. So this is one question: did Strad make bows, and are bows important to the player?
So the answer is yes. There are a few examples that still remain, and they're old sort of snakewood-looking bows, and they're Baroque, of course, which was the style back then. And just like Dennis's violin, when it was constructed, had a Baroque neck and a Baroque setup. And so, but those bows, because of the fragility in them, I think a couple of them exist still in the museum in Cremona, and they're supposedly by him. But other than that, I've never held one. I've never seen anybody or met anybody who has one by any of those old makers generally. But yes, the bow, there's a Stradivari of bows, and his name is Francois Tourt. And just like the best violins are Italian, the best bows are French. And so Francois Tourt was a bow maker who lived about 200 years ago, and his bows are incredibly valuable. And more often than not, that is the normal accompaniment to a Stradivari or Guarneri violin for most soloists, if they can find a way to sort of beg, borrow, and steal and get into it.
We have a question. Since you talked about modern makers, who are some of your favorite modern violin makers and bow makers today?
So violin-wise, I've been fortunate to work, here in Chicago with a number of makers that are connected to John Becker, and so his son Garrett and his assistant Keisuke Hori and Takeshi Nogawa. I think they build beautiful violins, and of course, like here in Chicago, we have Tetsuo Matsuda, and who has somehow made 500 violins, which I think is a testament to it's incredible how well he's done and how successful his making has been. On the cello side, I love Will Wedby. I think he makes beautiful instruments. And then, on the bow making side, I think I have a good friend in Colorado named Evan Orman, who I think is one of the best makers out there. People love his work. He's and then of course in Massachusetts you have there's the famous bow maker who is very popular right now. I'm sort of blanking for some reason, but he's another very good one. Do you know who I'm talking?
Yeah, and to be fair, this is Joe's opinion. There are so many, and if we ask another person, there's so many good makers, not only in the U.S. but all over, so that's totally an option for younger players now. And someone like Zygmunt a colleague of mine, Suvin Kim, he swears by Zygmunt and said, sounds as good as any Strad or Deljesu, and of course, he would still choose to play the Strad, but he really believes in Zygmunt and some makers in Europe and even Asia. I mean, there's incredible bow makers and violin makers all across Asia. So that's definitely an option that is there now, because when we were young, those options were not there.
Yeah, there are very few makers, and you had the Beckers and you had Parasone and you had a few things here and there, but and that's the nice thing too, is that it is this is a mixer. It's like wine. It is a very subjective thing. So it's not. What Dennis likes does not mean it's right. It's what Dennis likes, and what I like is what I like, and what you like, that's the beauty of it. And so, and thankfully there's enough good making to go around. So
there's a question, and I think that the question, well, I'll just revise the question a little bit. How does one take care of a Strad? And that's not just Strad, of course. It's just violins in general. Is there special storage that you would suggest?
So the most basic thing you can do is when you're done playing, you take a unscented bounty paper towel, just like a little white square like this, and you wipe your violin down. And if you can do that and wipe off any sort of the perspiration or the rosin that you accumulate, and this is for all violins, but if you can just do that, that takes care of a lot of the potential wear on a violin. It's almost like just if you brush your teeth twice a day you're going to take, you're going to be okay in the long run for the most part. And nothing will build up. But then beyond that, most of the professionals I know will, also like the dentist, they will schedule, a checkup with their violin. They'll drop it off with the luthier they prefer or they know for a couple days every year to have it professionally cleaned and have the strings changed and to make sure that the bridge isn't warping and stuff like that. But the annual maintenance for these things that are, 7 and 8 figures now is still, it's less than most automobiles, like on an annual basis.
Right. Another thing that everyone is very careful with is humidity, of course, temperature, but a lot of violins, violins are like people. Some are more sensitive to humidity, some are less sensitive. So it's a hard question to answer, but of course we try to control the humidity and the temperature for all our instruments, Strad or not.
Yeah.
But like Joe said, just going and doing a checkup at least once a year is I think very important.
And I think they like consistency. And so, if you're in Orange County all the time, obviously it's wonderful. And, for the most part, and it gets hot, but it's generally pretty dry, I imagine. And, that's different than being in West Palm Beach. And that's different than being in Chicago or in Utah. And so, but if you're the thing that's hard are soloists and people or quartets who travel professionally. You're going from Orange County to Utah to Dallas, to Chicago, to New York, to Philly. And it's that travel that can be harder on instruments, and some instruments react well and some don't.
When you talk about travel, it's COVID. I haven't traveled in 9 months. What's traveling?
I know. I've been on a plane.
We have a question, and I know the answer to it, but are there certain parts of the Strad that have to be replaced over the centuries or have been replaced?
Yes. So naturally the strings, the bridge, the pegs, the tailpiece, things like that, those original versions don't exist. There are certain Stradivari instruments in museums. So in Madrid, there's a quartet of untouched Stradivari instruments. They have the original bridges, the original fingerboards, everything on them. So you can go see that. And as I alluded to earlier, almost all of these Stradivari violins have had their original necks replaced as well. And so you retain the scroll, like in other words, the peg box where the strings are held, but then you graft a different longer piece of wood in between the scroll and the body of the violin, and it's set at a different angle for more modern playing, which is sort of more powerful and made for bigger spaces.
Maybe Alexa can post some of these pictures, but who are some of your most famous clients, and what is the most expensive violin that you've ever been a part of the sale of?
So I think, what's nice about this world that I'm in, and that you're in as well, is that you meet people like along their journey, and you don't know what trajectory is coming for each person, and certain people seem like superstars, but Dennis is he's my second favorite Canadian violinist. And my first favorite is James Ennis, and so we've had a very nice relationship where we were both sort of he became friends with my dad, and we're the same age, and then now we went from 22-year-olds knowing one another to 40-year-olds knowing one another that are married with kids, and now there's a picture I have there where now all of a sudden we're going to concerts like with our daughters, and that's a picture Alexi has that he could share, and these are things that are, these are really special moments. And one of the things that I think it sort of illustrates is that, and Dennis is a very good example of this, is that, the life of a musician can be extremely nomadic. And, you look at Dennis's bio and the amount of cities he's worked in, and the amount of jobs, of the concertmaster jobs, mind you, like different continents. And then you go to school in a different country, and then you come back here and you do this. And then sometimes it's like, the person your instrument person sometimes is like one of the few constants in your life. Like as you have this like nomadic existence going from job to job or city to city and things like that, it's like you still come back and take your Strad to the same person, and things like that. So that's the thing. And most famously, I think that I was when I was at Bein Fushi, that's when the Violin Deljesu came in, and that was the first $18 million instrument. And, that was an instrument that, came to Bein Fushi at exactly the wrong moment as the financial crisis was happening in the fall of 2009, whatever that was. But that was a different price point. And that's one of those instruments that, is it the best instrument? I think plenty of people would say yes. But then there's also, but again, the subjectivity of it, I think the best way to say it is that it's one of, 9 or, maybe 6 or 7 instruments that whenever it is sold, it's a world record. So there were actually just 3 instruments that were sold to a client of ours here in the States, and he bought them at the very, very top of the market and paid $6 million for 3 different things, 2 violins and 1 Stradivari cello. And this was in like 1999. And all 3 of these instruments were just sold in the previous calendar year for just over 20 million. And so, you see like the prices obviously, and the value as the demand for these things, particularly from Russia, is really intense.
It's an incredible world, like you talked about, because when I was at school with actually my roommate in school was Suvin Kim, and somehow, luckily, right now both of us play Strads. But we remember changing our strings, and the first sound you make after changing your strings, it would be the brightest and the loudest, and we'd both be like, "Wow, it sounds like a Strad." And the fact that we both play Strads now is I mean, you can imagine. We feel grateful, and we talk about it all the time, actually. One other question here is it important can a non-professional make a great sound on the Strad? Is the question.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think it takes time. And I think my experience is that not everybody just jumps into a Stradivari violin and knows what to do with it. And there's a learning curve. And the things that come up sort of over and over again for me, most people tend to push a little too hard when they play a Stradivari violin. And a lot of Stradivari violins, and Dennis is the person to talk about this, not me, but the words I hear and the descriptions, time after time after time are, it's way more about bow speed than pressure, and it's playing a little closer to the bridge than you're used to, and it can be more finicky. And but at the same time, if you play that way, I think a lot of people say like, well, you should play with less tension, and you should play with a faster bow, and you should be closer to the bridge. Like this is not unorthodox thinking. These are things that generally coincide with, better violin players. And people who can do these sorts of things, then they of course will appreciate them. I mean, people don't buy these things or acquire these things and then not enjoy them. To have something like that in your life is really important. And so, for somebody to buy something like that, it's, that's a lifetime of work that goes into, acquiring a great instrument. And just like, and it becomes almost your most valuable possession. And it's something that, you care for greatly.
This is a question that people ask me, and my answer has kind of changed over time. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's important for the Strad to be played or preserved?
Say that one more time.
Is it more important for the Strad to be played or preserved in like a vault to keep it for its to keep it in the good condition?
Well, I say both. It's not mutually exclusive, because I think there are plenty of people who care for their instruments extremely well. You can play them and care for them as well. It's not one or the other. Of course, nothing is going to happen in it if it's in the vault. And there are instruments that have been preserved. I mentioned this quartet in Madrid, or the Messiah, which is the perfect Stradivari in Oxford, England. There are examples that are perfect and preserved and in museums for all of us and future generations of violin makers to see. I would like it. Yeah. I mean, I would like them to be appreciated and cared for and heard. It doesn't have to be heard by 2,000 people to validate it. But yeah, ideally they're played and they're cared for um, and so I think you can have both.
Right. I mean, and my answer changed because when I was young, I said absolutely every violin should be played. It's
Yeah.
built to be played. But more and more as I get older, I think that there has to be a small balance. I mean, there are a few of them should be kept, and so the condition will be pristine. And like you say, so that future generations could appreciate it. But yeah, it's a tough thing because I know a lot of banks just buy it. They put it in the vault just as an investment. Don't let anyone touch it. And in some ways, it's very sad. But in some ways, you think you're like, maybe that violin in 20 years will be in the same condition. So maybe it's not all a bad thing.
Yeah, for sure, and they take turns, and it's almost like, I mean, as you, especially for the two of us, it's like, cooking and food. I mean, there's a lot of parallels in the restaurant world and things like that. And it's like, I imagine like a restaurant, and sometimes you think of these Stradivari violins, and when they go into the hands of some players, it is intense, and some players have a ton of perspiration, or some people are just careless about it, sadly. And that's like you're on the high heat, and you're on that like really intense burner at the front. But then other times, I've worked with people where they're not professional violinists, but when there's a violin that I remember, it was the first Guadagnini I ever sold, and when I recently got it back and sold it again last year, and it was handed back to me in exactly the same condition as when I sold it in 2004.
Right.
And was it concertized on? A little bit, like at church. It was not on stage, but it also, this lady was this unbelievable caretaker for it, and she loved it, and she played it every single day. She didn't resent it. Some people do with their instruments,
Right.
like that.
Well,
So
yeah, and I feel bad because yeah, when I play, especially when I play solo, I sweat and sweat gets on the fiddle. But I think that's part of it. I think that Strad built this to be played. So
I mean,
yeah.
they're remarkably durable. I mean, that's the thing that is often overlooked, is just how thin the things are, and the tops and the backs and things like that. But they are remarkably durable, but they still need to be cared for.
This is a question that I know everyone wants to ask. How do you tell the difference between a Strad copy and a real Strad? Because as you can imagine, I think half the violins that I've ever seen say Stradivarius inside. How do you tell the difference?
So the label I showed earlier, or that Alexi showed earlier, that's not difficult to forge. And so I don't know if we could see that label again, and for people maybe who joined us, after the first 5 minutes, these labels that exist in these Stradivari violins, it's not difficult to replicate them. So Alexi, if you have that label shot again, basically there are a lot of violins out there that have this, this Antonia Stradivarius, Fasiba Cremona, and so people show these violins, and there's Sears and Roebuck, 120 years ago in this country would make a series of violins, and they'd sell these Stradivarius violins, and they all have these labels in them. So, but the difference is, real Stradivari instruments, they have a glow to them,
Right.
and there is a patina to them that is unique. And there is a shape to them that is unique. And so, one of the things, like if we have the outline of either Dennis's violin or the other Stradivari violin, I have a picture of, like that one there would be fine. There's an outline to this violin by the purfling, which are these small stained strips going around the edges, and they are made and they're unique to each maker because these makers used a certain form to build their instruments. And part of it too is that, like, when you, and I've said this before in front of Dennis, is that your experience and your context is really critical in this, because just like when we go around and we meet people in our life, if you meet somebody for the first time, sometimes you can tell how old they are, or sometimes you can tell, if they're Korean or Japanese or Israeli or Canadian or Icelandic, and that's part of your sort of your own like internal database, because what those people look like and you have experience with people. And violins are the same way, where if you're seeing violins all the time and you're studying them, you start to learn what 300-year-old maple looks like. You start to learn what 100-year-old maple looks like. And you start to learn that Venetian violins have a different look than Cremonese violins, and those that are made in Ireland, for example. So there's more to it than that, but for the sake of brevity, I would say that, that's my answer.
Right.
The other thing too, but is that Stradivari violins have always been highly sought after. So, for example, the Medici ordered literally the royal family in Florence, the banking dynasty. They ordered them. The king and queen in Spain ordered a quartet. The aristocracy ordered these instruments. So they've also always gone into these great homes. So from their very creation, they've been incredibly valuable and incredibly, they're highly sought after. So they've been in the great homes of Europe and then beyond since then. So they're not just coming out of the attic like some people think they are. And generally, these Stradivari violins are already in great homes, and they tend to be surrounded by other, very valuable items as well.
Right. I mean, the picture that Joe showed where we were in Hong Kong, I mean, the Strads were in the tens of millions, but he had a Picasso, he had a Monet, and there was one, I don't remember, but there was one Chinese artist that he had, and he showed it. It was in his bedroom, and he said that's worth 2 Monets. And so, like you say, I mean, these people who collect this stuff, valuable stuff, I mean, they know what they want and the beauty, and I hope all of you guys can witness when Joe talked about the glow of the Strad, the look in his eye. I mean, this is a guy who loves these instruments. I mean, this is not someone who buys and sells. I mean, of course, it is a business, but I mean, this is stuff that he loves and he appreciates and respects, and that's why I think that he's been so successful. Another reason you're successful is the first time my wife saw you, she was like, "Wow, that guy's really good looking."
Great.
I hope my wife's not watching.
Wants a break, yeah.
This is, I mean, you talk about the Medici and all the royalty, but recently in America, who are some people who really invested in these instruments?
So I think, early on, I think, in America, Henry Ford was an early collector of violins like this. So if you go to Dearborn, Michigan, and you go to the Henry Ford Museum, amongst the airplane and I believe the bus that Rosa Parks was on, that when she refused to sit down in this incredible moment in civil rights, like a few rooms over is his Stradivari, his Neri Deljesu, his Bergonzi, and his Amati.
It's incredible.
The famous jeweler Tiffany, the original Tiffany of New York, was also a client of the Hills, who owned fine things like that. And then later in life, I mean, actually, I mentioned Sears earlier. Like the Sears family here in Chicago, they also owned violins like this. And then further down the line, the Galvin family that created Motorola were early clients of my dad and Jeff's, and they are they're the people who really invented the Stradivarius Society and really kind of pushed forward this need for patronage in this country, and and understanding it is something that seems to be far more well supported elsewhere. You have Nippon Foundation, you have Samsung, you have the bank in Vienna, you have the Dextra in Norway. I mean, it just seems like there's greater support abroad for artists than with instruments than there is in this country. And to me, obviously, that's something I'm working to change, because one of the things that's so nice about dealing with musicians like Dennis is that, I mean, I find that dealing with musicians they're people that have sort of a purity of heart. And this is, I'm not to get like too hyperbolic about it, but like nobody gets into music for the money, right? It's like, it's just something that that I understand people you have to do. It's the reason my dad didn't, stop going to music school. He said that everybody else in his studio was willing to die for their music, and he wasn't. And it's a very, people, I think musicians in general are just very honest with themselves in a way that teachers are. And obviously plenty of musicians like Dennis are also teachers. And I just think that, those are the types of people that we need to support more as a society, because you guys are obviously supporting us with your art, and this is a conversation I would have during normal times, not just during right now, where the performing arts are obviously at a really critical juncture and do not seem to have the support of a government bailout or other like the other industries do. But it's really critical. And
Yeah.
and so, finding a solution for that and is one thing, but the first question is, yeah, I mean, putting these instruments into the hands of people who care for them and appreciate them and who deserve them, that's the kind of work I want to be doing and the kind of work I try to do. And then, to see my friends succeed has always been, I mean, that's something that's what makes me happiest, regardless of whatever we're doing. I'm one that definitely gets, great joy from seeing others happy.
Right. I mean, ever since I've had the fiddle, I mean, every audition I've gone to or every concert I've gone to, you feel like you have the best equipment in the world. So, you always have this advantage. And of course, a lot of it is that it's the great fiddle, but really psychologically, you have that advantage going in. So it makes all the difference. And
what Dennis does too with these auditions and with these concerts, I think, what some people don't realize is that, there's a reason that the Indianapolis 500, like the cars are all the same. It's trying so you can discern the differences in the drivers. And so like, that's not what an audition is like.
Right.
Not what the Tchaikovsky competition is like. I mean, these are things that are really intense, and people show up with different equipment. And so like, if you imagine like the Indianapolis 500 that way, I mean, how would that be fair if, somebody shows up with a Corvette and another person shows up with a 1982 Camry and another person shows up with a Mercedes and another person shows up with whatever. It's like, it's not a level playing field.
Exactly. And except for very few people, I think Gil Shahan might be one, but everyone else, there's somebody who's sponsored and someone who's supporting these great artists. So you're doing incredible work for all the musicians, of course, and helping investors pick the right stuff that's authentic and in the right conditions. So as a musician, I'm grateful to people like you who are experts and again who love music and who love this art. I wish you good health during these COVID times.
I know, right? That's where the bar is set. It's like, and we're grateful for that. It's like, and we're dealing with homeschooling with the kids like a lot of people are right now. And it's, it's miserable for everybody. It's miserable for the kids, the teachers, the parents. And it's like, but at the same time, I'm a very glass half full kind of guy, and I get to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with the kids every day.
Right.
And
that's
the case.
Exactly. One last question is, and it's going to be hard for you to answer, but I'll try to answer. What kind of violins do the people in the Pacific Symphony have who are not in the principal seats? And I'm going to say we have, instruments from the whole range, especially in the string section. We have stuff that's old. We have modern instruments. We have very valuable instruments. We have less valuable instruments. So, especially in America, I think, if you're a great player, no matter the instrument, they'll give it a chance. Where a place like, Berlin Phil, Vienna Phil, if you don't have the right kind of sound, right kind of instrument, it's much more difficult. So, I hope that answers your question. But an orchestra of 100 people, they all have different kinds of instruments. And I think that's kind of the reason it's special. It's not like we're all using the same instrument to try to create the same sound. We're trying to create the same sound with all these different kinds of instruments.
Do you feel like, Dennis, when you listen to, obviously you have a history in Philadelphia, but like, if you hear the Philly Orchestra from the 60s or the 70s or something like that, they all have great instruments.
Right.
They all have Strads, but there's a different sound. And they at least have a Galliano almost. Right. And I think, they were, and there's a number of factors. They were more accessible than, price wise and things like that. But I think there's a different sound sometimes to these older orchestras, and that's part of it.
Right. And any of you watching right now, if you want to invest in an instrument and let a Pacific Symphony player play it, I think there would be many, many people who would be very grateful to help you out. It was fascinating talking to you today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Like I said, I think there'll be enough interest to have you on again in the future, maybe after COVID, and hopefully you can come back and do another little demonstration for our board members, our musicians, and even some of our fans. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I love going to these things where you do all the work, and 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 you literally sing for your supper, and I just show up, and people treat me well.
No, it's great, and like I said, I think all the people watching today, it's been really fascinating, and please, anyone who has more questions, go to Joe's website. Your company is the Joe Bein Company, is that right?
It's called Bein and Company.
Bein and Company. He's located in Chicago, but as you can tell, he'll travel. If you're looking for a $1 million violin, he's happy to come out to California and show it to you. So I hope that all of you, everyone watching today, stays safe. I know that Corona is reaching new heights, and I hope that all of us are safe. And soon we'll be back on stage doing what we love, and you can be back and watching and being part of it, because that's the most important thing for us, to be able to play for our loyal fans and audience. And thank you, Joe, again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.